So thank you for having me here. Thank you to the CPA in Virginia for always being there when we've had requests for grants. You guys are great. I don't know what to do without you. Dick Frary, my mentor. I really appreciate him being there. And then there's Samuel Wright, who talk about in a little bit, because he wrote a history of the west part, and we're going to talk about the west part of it tonight. So thanks for the opportunity to bend your ear about cemeteries in general, about Southampton Cemeteries in particular. We all wear a lot of hats. People here are all involved people. One of mine has to do with cemeteries. I've been a member of Southampton Cemetery Commission for over 25 years and served 2 terms on the board of directors on the Association for Gravestone Studies, which is an international group actually based in Greenfield. The duties in those positions range from selling lots, keeping records and updating maps, to chopping brush and hauling out trash, procuring land for future burial space, interfacing with other town committees and commissions, applying for funding, and participating in workshops and conferences. It's our responsibility to make sure the grass is mowed, get the stones repaired if we can, trees planted, trees cut down. That was good timing, I must say, cutting down those big trees. I don't know if you've noticed, but there were a whole row of dead trees that we took down in the fall, right before that big storm. But best of all, although that's all necessary, it all gives me an excuse to get down to the cemeteries, because I've always liked cemeteries. And that might sound a little strange to you. You all might want to move away from me on the Group W bench, but there's really quite a few of us out there. I represent the sentiment of a bumper sticker distributed by the Gravestone Study Association that reads, "Caution, I break for old graveyards." And from the manicured vista of the Hope Cemetery in Barry, Vermont, which is really worth the trip, to the hidden burial grounds secreted deep in the woods of small New England towns, the stones and the grounds themselves have called out, just pay attention, listen to the stories they have to tell. And today I have a presentation that's basically in 2 parts. The first will discuss all the educational possibilities that abound in the cemetery, and then we'll take a figurative walk through our town cemeteries while I share with you some of the stories that are carved in stone there. So what is a cemetery? It seems like a simple question. It's a final resting place for our loved ones, our friends. It's a place to honor those who've passed on, a place of quiet, a place of reflection, a place of grief, and a place to set aside grief and remember those who've gone before. It's a place where absolute strangers become eternal neighbors, and where a handful of letters and numbers carved in stone leave a lasting message for the generations that follow. It is a community of the dead, a neighborhood, if you will. And that neighborhood is also a wonderful outdoor classroom. All around you in the cemetery are opportunities for multidisciplinary study, especially if you're teachers or if you're parents and grandparents. These are a few examples, any one of which could be expanded into a talk in its own right. Look at geology. What kind of stones are used? Around here you might see Connecticut Valley brownstone. They're those reddish stones. They're easy to carve, and a lot of it. East Long Meadow has a huge, what's the word I'm looking for? Quarry, yes, of them. And there's marble and slate. There's schist and limestone and granite. So the question is, where would they come from? Why is this stone here? If you're way up in Vermont, why might you see some Connecticut Valley brownstone when they've got all this granite to work from? Well, maybe they were from here, and that made them feel like home. To ship up the river, a big piece of stone to be carved, have it feel like home. Then there's symbology. It's so much fun to go through. Following the shifts in American stones, you go from skulls, death skulls, to cherubs, from urn and willow to pointing fingers, and they point every direction. It's so funny. You can, and then you have broken flowers, and lambs and butterflies and snakes and imps and bats and hourglasses and ornate florals. Up in the Barre, Vermont, there's a soccer ball that must be 3 feet across. And 18-wheelers I've seen. There's actually one in our cemetery here in town, an 18-wheeler on there. You never know what you're going to find. So these images are windows into how people have expressed their relationship to and their understanding of life and their understanding of death and beyond through hundreds of years. All juxtaposed within yards of each other. You've got history shrunk down in time and space to where we can just reach out and touch it, centuries from one hand to the other. When you're looking at it, you can think about landscape architecture. Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Mass. ushered in the era of the rural cemetery movement with its lush garden cemetery setting. It was designed by Olmsted and it opened in 1831, and that represented a major shift in how cemeteries were regarded. A shift from a churchyard and backyard burial grounds of our early American heritage to an inviting park setting. Now, our Center Cemetery has its feet in both worlds. It's a structured rural cemetery, and yet, especially over in sections 1 and 2, a little more relaxed about where things are laid out. And the west part's really more of a burial ground. It's got less structure. It's laid out all over the place. If you look down as a bird's eye, it's really hard to follow it. The newest trend is toward green cemeteries, eco-cemeteries, with minimal markers and emphasis on native plants and natural settings. And some have no stones at all, and you have to have a GPS to get to the spot that you need to get to. Now, the carver's art. You may not think about that too much, but somebody's hand was on that stone. Not so much the new ones, they're done with machinery, but the old ones are done by hand. And there's a whole field of looking, what is the real nerdy. What's the cut on this number 2? And I know that it's so and so because of the way the curve goes in the bottom of the 3. You can search probate records, you can look for signed stones or artistic patterns that identify a gravestone as a product of a particular carver or a school of carvers. You'll have a school that have similar designs and they've been taught, and they go out and then they design it, they carve them in other areas. So this is artwork. It's artwork that you can touch. It's artwork that you can feel the mark that the artists made. It's an interactive museum, if you will. It's a lesson in art history. And the last thing I want to talk about is the sociology of it. You've got the words and the images on the stones provide such insight into the interrelationship of the individuals in society during the time that's frozen in that stone. So who were we then? Who are we now? What do we want others to know about us, to remember? What message do we want to leave? The stones are a pulse, the pulse on the life of current cultural attitudes. And then we can look back and see that same pulse decades and hundreds of years before. So these are among the many disciplines that work together to make a cemetery into a classroom. And they're a unique opportunity to teach children in a hands-on classroom, while at the same time teaching respect for the stones and the people they represent. I would really encourage you, if you have children in your family or if you're a teacher, to take the children out to the cemetery and let them know it's not creepy. It's a beautiful place to be, and have them learn about the stones, talk to them about the people that are on there. I worked with a homeschool group once. They invited me in, and they were tremendous. They said they wanted to know how to clean stones, so I taught them that. But I suggested that they pick a stone, maybe someone their own age, maybe something their parents' age, and then research in town hall. What did that person do for a living? What did they die from? How old were they? What part of town did they live in? And they did it. They did it. They were awesome. They were just it was just wonderful to have that kind of response. So let's go to the cemetery. Let's start out west part. If you're not familiar with the west part, and most of you here probably are, but there might be a couple who aren't because it's out a bit. It's about a 4-mile drive up Fomer Road. Part of it's dirt, part of it's paved. But all of a sudden on your left, you're going to see a steep hill with a stone wall, and there is this lovely old cemetery, really more of the graveyard. And if, Kathy, you should ride your horse up there, that's perfectly all right, because there are, if you look on those stones, there are rings embedded put your reins around so that the horses can stay. That is what they did with the horses that came to the funerals. Parking your car is a little trickier up there. There's really no space. So this section of town up there is called Fomer as a nod to the many brooks and the south branch of the Manhan that frothed and foamed as they tumbled over the rocks. It was these waters that made the area economically viable, and they fostered the cider mills and the sawmills that dotted the landscape. There were at least 8 cider mills, 3 brandy distilleries, and numerous sawmills that ebbed and flowed with the fortunes of the community. It was busy at one time, but then the population dropped off, due in part to the rough, rocky land whose soil played out after just a few years. The Holyoke Water Company bought up the land, I understand sometimes, not always, by the most scrupulous means, and dammed up the river and the stream for reservoirs, cutting off the flow needed for the sawmills and the cider mills. And this group here is filled with historians who could tell you better than I the reasons that the once active community dissipated, but homes became cellar holes, sturdy stone walls crumbled, roads were neglected and they grew to brush, and nature took back her due. Still, there was a schoolhouse serving the Fomer area until 1921, when Evelyn Coe, who would become Evelyn Parsons, taught the last class there. I'm going to date myself here, but she continued on to teach generations of Southampton school children. I was in her 4th grade class in November 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated, with you, Barry. Yeah. There were over 40 homesteads up there in the day, and there were lots of marriages between the households and those of nearby Montgomery and then Norwich, which is part of Huntington, Westhampton. Lots of babies, and inevitably deaths, and the need for a burial place for the locals. There were burials at West Part at least by 1788, the year that Isaac and Mindwell Parsons buried their stillborn son under a stone that is no longer present. And that's very interesting because often stillborn children or young babies were not given stones. They were just quietly buried. So that really says something that this little boy was honored so way. The town records start mentioning the West Part Cemetery in 1810, when more property was purchased to formalize the space, and then in ensuing years for building and improving the fence, had to figure out what rods were. I was reading how many rods. Who knows how long, how much, what makes up a rod?
17 feet?
16 feet.
5.5 yards, so you're all pretty close there, okay. The last recorded burial was that of Noah Clark, and he died in 1904. But tread carefully up there. There are souls that are trying to rest, like Ruby. Ruby Pomeroy Seward died up in the west part of pneumonia in the winter of 1840. Her husband, Alpheus, was not home, and there was no road broken through the deep and frozen snow to the burial ground. So, the neighbors ingeniously removed the box from an old sleigh, lashed her coffin to it, and hauled it hand over hand over hand, over and above the snowbound fence posts to the cemetery. Unfortunately, they buried her in the very spot that was to become the driveway. When the entrance road was graded, they smoothed it out directly over Ruby's bones. And there's the Burt family still active in town. Samuel Burt was very proud of being first first in everything. He and his family were the subject of a number of firsts. He was the first settler in the west part, around 1735. He was prominent in town. He held many elected positions. He was the precinct treasurer. He was selectman. And he was involved in procuring the land for the minister Jonathan Judd to live. Among other duties, in 1753, he was on a committee to, quote, dignify the seats in the meeting house. I take this to be a pecking order, giving the most important people the best seats right in front. Wouldn't they be surprised to see the crush in the back rows today? Now, his great-great-grandfather married a Mary Holton in Northampton in 1665, and that was supposed to be the first marriage there. And he wanted us to be sure to remember that he was one of the first settlers in Southampton, so he put it right on his stone. Another not so illustrious first had to do with our same friend Samuel. Sometime around 1745, he was out hunting some of the wild beasties that plagued the settlers and nipped into their livestock. His partner in hunting was his close friend, Mr. Joseph King of town, and they were hunting up on Bungay Mountain, which is actually over into Montgomery, but it kind of does both. And they split up to better hunt the bears and the other wild animals. Mr. King stopped to eat his lunch, sitting on a convenient log with his faithful dog right next to him, when Mr. Burt came from behind and mistook his dog for a wild animal. Burt fired his weapon. Tragically, his shot hit home, right through Mr. King's brain, killing him instantly. It's said that Mr. Burt forsook firearms from then on. I told you it got a little gruesome once in a while. Yeah. But Samuel's wife, Mrs. Hannah Burt, was a noted midwife, and her stone, oh, her stone is my favorite in all of town. It was carved in schist in the style of a family called Sykes. They were the carvers. You've got to go up and see it. It's not real big, but it's got a picture of her and ivy all around the edges. And it's just lovely. Makes me happy. It's the only one like it in town. And then there are the Searles. Israel Searle lived nearby Burt. Sometime about the time of Burt's death in 1799, the Burt homestead burned down. And the story goes that neighbor Searle picked up a chest from the burning house and carried it across the road to safety. And when challenged to do it again, he found that he was unable to duplicate his heroics from when he had been all pumped up with adrenaline. The power of friendship and necessity, ever strong. Okay, one more gruesome one. Israel Searle went into the woods to gather up his swine that had spent part of the autumn feasting there on beech nuts. Only half of them were where he expected. The other half were found sniffing around the nearly nude corpse of a man. An investigation ensued, causing Mr. Searle to be detained by authorities for about a week. In an age without cell phones, his worried family had absolutely no idea where he was. When it was determined that the body belonged to an insane man who had wandered into the forest and died from exposure, Searle was released. Okay, one more gruesome Searle story. Israel's oldest son, Lyman B., met with a terrible accident in his father's sawmill, catching his hand in the machinery, and he could not extricate himself. The gears gripped his arm and pulled it in and crushed it up to his shoulder. His brother Wharton happened by and heard the groans and extricated the victim under Lyman's own direction. Despite having a respected surgeon called in from Northampton, Lyman did not survive the terrible misadventure. In fact, the surgeon, a Dr. Flint, well named, reportedly took one look at the situation and told onlookers, "Cover up the dead man." Within a few hours, Lyman Searle fulfilled that prophecy. One more more Searle story. A different Israel Searle died in 1824 at the age of 24. He was one of the many young men of Southampton who pursued missionary work around the world, and he died in Monrovia in West Africa. He's got a stone. How'd he get home? Well, just between you and me, I've heard that they wanted to get him home from Africa. The only way they could think to do it was to pickle him. So they put him in a big barrel, filled it up with spirits, and sent him home. I'm not saying that happened, but I'm not saying it didn't, okay?
Makes a good story.
Yeah, and the gentler side of the Searle family is through the lovely marker for baby Ella, daughter of Horton and Mary Searle. She was the only child out of their brood not to survive to adulthood, and she died at 1 year and 7 days. Her gravestone stands out from the rest of the family plot in the expression of its tender verse and the delicate carving of a broken bud, signifying a life cut short. It's written, "She was but given a fair bud to earth to blossom in heaven." I've often mused on this lovely stone, which stands out so distinctly from the soldierly tidy rows of Searles, which in themselves stand in contrast to the rather more haphazard scattering of the rest of the stones in Westport. So just one more story to share before we move back to the Center Cemetery. The Hatches have a stone in the cemetery there. Eliphalet, say that 6 times fast, Eliphalet and Rebecca Hatch lived in a married state for 71 years. Important to them because they put it right on the stone. They were aged 93 and 91 when they passed, just over a year apart. Wow. He was a blacksmith. He was a gun maker. She had 9 children over the course of 20 years. No antibiotics, no vaccines, no urgent care centers, no Band-Aids. And yet they both outlived today's actuarial tables by about 15 years. Now that is good Southampton stock. So we're back to Center Cemetery. The first burial in the Center Cemetery occurred before it was a cemetery. In March in 1738, a 19-year-old boy by the name of Simeon Waite died here in town. And of course it was by drinking too much water, of course. He was the first non-native person recorded as dying in this southern part of Northampton, which was then called Newtown on the Manhan. A space was cleared in the woods and he was laid to rest. Sometime prior to 1754, the town acquired the land, for in that year it was voted that the remainder of the clearing be done at the burying ground. That took a few more years, as evidenced by entries in Reverend Jonathan Judd's diary and in town records. Simeon's stone is still there, leaning a bit beneath a cedar tree. As to the water, wouldn't he be surprised to know that just a few years back, we were voted the best small town water in the country? It took many tries at times to get cemetery matters passed in town meeting. Many eventually did get the nod. In 1775, it was voted to purchase digging tools. Then in 1803, straps to lower the bodies into the ground were okayed. In 1804, it was proposed that the town purchase a hearse. And 25 years later, in 1829, $40 was finally voted for the purchase of that hearse. In 1855, a new hearse was purchased at the cost of $145. And it was available until 1889, when it must have been taken out of service, and Easthampton's Mr. James Morrison's hearse was hired as needed. I'm sure you've noticed coming up High Street a small brick structure at the edge of the cemetery, close to where High Street and College Highway meet. That was the town tomb, used to store bodies in the winter until the ground could be dug come springtime. It was first mentioned in town meeting in 1836, but it was not built until 1875. This was at a cost of $275. I've had some up-close and personal experience with that tomb. As a youngster, I was visiting the cemetery with my friend Jill Frary, whose brother Mark had a summer job mowing there. He pulled a teenage prank and closed me inside the tomb, which by that time was used to store mowers and fuel. It might have been just a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. It's dark in there, and it's clammy, and it's creepy. As early as 1770, there was discussion of putting an iron fence to replace the various post and rail, stone wall, and picket fences that bracketed the burial ground. But it was not until 1900, when William Foley donated $1,000 to the town, that the present metal fence was installed. It was purchased right at Lyman Sheet Metal at a cost of $903.81, and I just spent just about that much money on paint for it this week. The Civil War monument took less time to clear town meeting in the hurdles. An article was voted in March 1865 to raise a memorial in memory of the Southampton soldiers who died in the recent rebellion. And it was dedicated the next year. Some kind of speed record, I think, for town things. Recently, more names were added on a granite marker at the base to recognize men who fought for the town, even though they may not have hailed from here. We have Mr. Frary, not the one who locked me in the tomb, to thank for updating the Civil War listings, as well as procuring funding to clean and straighten existing stones and to provide new flat granite markers as needed to mark the veterans' graves. And then the Cemetery Commission was established in 1900, providing for 3 commissioners to oversee the maintenance and growth of the property. So some stories. I love the stories. Our dear Mildred Cook lies at rest under a spreading oak along with 2 of her children. Mildred, who we remember as a church stalwart, an intrepid writer of encouraging notes, and active on the staff of the church newsletter at an age when most of us would be content to sit back and let others take over. She was a wonderful lady who found a certain unwelcome celebrity in this lifetime. The dates on the children's modest stones reveal a terrible tragedy. 8-year-old Eleanor died July 6, 1944, while 6-year-old Edward died July 7, 1944. The youngsters were victims of the horrendous Hartford Circus fire. You may remember that Emily's remains, identified as Little Miss 1565, were not identified and returned to Southampton until 1991, 28 years ago, when she was disinterred from her Connecticut grave and laid to rest beside her brother Edward. Even then, Mildred did not believe that this little girl was her Emily. So the mystery is not really settled, and I have to go with a mother's instincts. We were fortunate to have Mildred among us well into her 90s. So much heartbreak, so much trauma, so much history, so many stories expressed in those few terse numbers and letters carved on small, flat pieces of marble. Not far from the grave of Simeon Waite, the one who died 281 years ago from drinking too much cold water, are 2 marble table stones toward the rear of Section 3, supported by pillars, and they're quite grand by Southampton standards. One marks the grave of our first minister, Reverend Jonathan Judd, and his wife, Silence. The lengthy inscription celebrates their lives, their virtue, their piety, To the memory of Jonathan Judd, the first minister of Christ in Southampton, and of Mrs. Silence Judd, his amiable and worthy consort. He saw his people, 30 families, increase to nearly 1,000 souls, was able, evangelical, and faithful in preaching, was eminent in piety, wisdom, meekness, benevolence. He lived greatly respected and beloved, and after a ministry of more than 60 years, rested from his labors. That's all written down there. Hard to read right now. Luckily, other people transcribed it. Heart-wrenchingly, 4 of their grandchildren are included, none of whom lived past 11 weeks of age. Such a monument to the lives of the judge is entirely appropriate and what you might expect for people who held such important positions in town history, which makes the following story even more poignant. A short walk over to section 4 finds us standing at a weathered marble stone which marks the grave of the wife of the town's third minister. It's a striking, though time-worn, commemoration of her life. Yet for many years, she lay in an unmarked grave. Not until 1898, 56 years after her death, was the memorial placed. A local lady wrote at the time that the gentle and beloved Louisa Payson White, wife of Reverend Emmy White, lies in a lonely, neglected grave. The ladies of the congregation raised a handsome stone to her memory. 2 generations have passed, and those who knew her and who loved her are her companions in silence. The story unfolds that Reverend White, who continued as pastor in town for some 11 years after his wife's death in 1842, never arranged for a stone to mark her remains. Instead, it was the First Congregational Church's Ladies' Aid Society which stepped up those many years later and erected the monument. A fine, generous, and noble thing to do. But not, I must note, without giving themselves some credit. Right on the stone it says that the ladies of Southampton gave this stone to her memory. But where was Reverend Morris White, all this time? How could he ignore her? Had he no respect? What kind of man could be so cold and uncaring as to leave others to fulfill this final duty to the memory of his life's companion? Oh, we know he was the center of plenty of controversy during his 21-year ministry in Southampton. During his tenure, excommunications abounded, and the list of people forcibly removed from the church, including a few Searles, is full of names that are familiar even today. His popularity eroded as he got embroiled in political struggles with prominent citizens and got caught plagiarizing. He and the church dissolved their relationship just before Christmas of 1852, whereupon 34 new members immediately joined the congregation. Pretty rough stuff. So it seems pretty clear. What we have here is a man so devoid of character he didn't even bother to put a rock with her name on it over his wife's grave. And yet a friend and a fellow minister wrote of White and his wife, quote, "He had the sense and the sentiment to know her worth. Her removal was to him a stunning and bewildering stroke, which quite unmanned him. Months after the storm broke upon him, calling at my house in Amherst and seeing my wife, told that she was once a pupil of his wife in Andover, he burst into tears and wept for an hour like a child." I really felt for this guy. I set aside all the judgment. I gave him total benefit of the doubt. And I imagined him lying in an unmarked grave, still grieving for the loss of Louisa. You know, that image worked for me for about 20 years. Right up until last year when Mr. Bill Bray found reference to him in an old book following the lives of men of the cloth. Well, turns out that Reverend White found himself a rich widow and retired to Switzerland, where he lived out a very comfortable life. Come walk with me. We're headed north to section 6 to meet Fanny, Knox, Parsons. But first, let's stop and admire the lovely metal markers that grace our cemetery. These monuments are cast from zinc with removable decorative panels that can be recast as needed with updated names and dates. Inside, they're hollow to save on weight and expense, and they weather beautifully and they last basically forever. Most graveyards and cemeteries have at least one, usually purchased by the person who represented the zinc monument company locally. Southampton must have had a good salesperson because there are at least 3 in Center Cemetery. And these markers have a little interesting bit of lore to them. Because the panels can be removed with the proper tools, and because they are hollow inside, word has it that in some areas they were used as hiding places for stashes of booze during Prohibition. Now, there is no evidence that this occurred here, but there is no evidence that it didn't either. Oh, here we are. We've reached the Parsons family plot, where Fanny lies at rest. Shh. Next to her is her 2-year-old daughter, Abby May, safe in the arms of Jesus. Fanny Knox Parson, the stone reads, died November 28, 1891, aged 33 years, 3 months. She hath done what she could. How this has haunted me. I thought about it over and over. She hath done what she could. I mean, whose idea was it to put that on the stone? And I would think about it. I'd be driving along. She hath done what she could. She hath done. Finally, I went to Cooperstown on a historical conference, and it was on gravestones. And there was a break in the conference, and I was looking around, and there were some homemade books, real thick, full of pictures of gravestones. I'll tell you, I am a nerd, I admit. Yeah, I really am. Pictures. And one of them, when I opened it up, was a giant stone. And it was the stone of Carrie Nation. You remember who Carrie Nation is? She was famed for her work in the temperance movement, famous for smashing up barrooms with a hatchet in Kansas. There's a photo of that sizable stone, and the stone says, "She hath done what she could." Whatever one might think of her politics and methodology, it can't be argued that this is a woman who made her mark, and she stood up for what she believed in and gave it her all. She hath done what she could. She deserves our pity. Fanny lost a young child. She hath done what she could. Wait a minute. She may have accomplished something. She hath done what she could. But this woman's a doer. She's an activist. She hath done what she could. This is one strong woman. She hath done what she could. Go get 'em, Fanny. With the age of the internet, I now know that that line is from the Bible, Mark 14:8, where Jesus reproached Judas and was being critical of a woman who had anointed him with costly ointment of pure nard. Why has it been wasted? We could have raised maybe. Okay, that's my Jesus Christ Superstar thing. We could have sold it and gotten good money for it and given it to the poor. Let her alone, said Jesus, for she has done a beautiful thing. She has done what she could. She has anointed me before I was buried. Wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So Fanny is paying it forward, doing what she could, acting with honor and courage in the face of derision, and sending a message to the future generations of strength and determination, a message carved in humble letters on the face of a cold, hard stone. So take a walk in one of our cemeteries. Take your time. Listen to the stones. Have a picnic. It really is a friendly place. So I leave you with a message from the stone of one of my great-great-great-great-grandparents. Of both of them, they're together in the same, Elijah and Thankful Clapp, who rest in Center Cemetery. Farewell, dear friend. My memory keep, while in death's arms his body sleep. Short was my stay with you below. Sooner or later, all must go. Thank you so much.